This episode of the Lunch with Chris show is brought to you by my upcoming book, 30 Days to Limitless. You can find out more about it at limitless30.com.
This podcast is certified fresh. Freshmediaworks.com.
Welcome to the Lunch with Chris show, where your host, Chris Daly, talks with movers and shakers from all walks of life to get their opinions on important questions. Each season, there is a new question and new guests. This short, impactful show skips all the fluff and just brings you insightful answers from great guests. And now, doing his part to change the world in a positive way, your host, Chris Daly.
If I were to list my next guest's accomplishment, it would take the whole show. But suffice it to say, you will be super impressed when you are introduced to Dr. Terrie Wurzbacher. All right, everybody join me in welcoming Dr. Terrie Wurzbacher to the show. Dr. Wurzbacher, how are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me on.
Oh, you bet, you bet. Now, I know now you're in the San Antonio area, but I want to go way back and tell me where you grew up.
On Long Island in New York.
Okay.
And you'll be able to tell that the more I talk because of my accent. So.
Right. Cool. And then, you've done so many things. Give me some of your background in childhood, in school, how you got into all this stuff.
Well, which all this stuff do you, I can tell you, I think pretty succinctly. I always wanted to be a doctor. When I was 4, God told me I was going to be a doctor. So even though that was back, I was born in 48, that was a long time ago, I had one purpose in mind. And then I got derailed because my senior year, I only applied to one school. They changed the rules and I wasn't ready to go anyway, but I didn't know that. And I got rejected, so I had to get a job. Oh, my God, you know how that goes. Well, I wasn't trained for a job. I was trained to continue studying, so what a big culture shock. So the next year I applied again, and I got rejected again. All of this, in retrospect, was actually excellent, so I'm not regretful in any way, shape, or form. And finally, the third year, I think was about the time Title IX came into play. I don't know that for sure that was a factor, but it seems like that was the reason I finally got accepted to medical school, very gratefully, of course. So I did, I went to school in Iowa. That was a big shock for a New York girl. Joined the Navy so that I could pay the rest of my education, medical school education. Was only going to do my 2 years required, and 30 years later, I retired from the Navy. Nothing like making quick decisions. And then when I retired from the Navy, I moved back to San Antonio and got a job with the Army doing the exact same thing I was doing as active duty for the Navy, so that all worked out for me. And then right at the beginning of the pandemic in 2020, I retired for good. But my running career began, I hated running, and in the Navy, fortunately, we could do the swim for the physical fitness test. But in 1993, I tore my ACL playing softball. I had surgery, and then here comes 1994. I go, oh, nuts, I have to get ready for the softball season. And I tried to run because I have to cover first base. I'm a catcher, and I couldn't, so I made myself work at it until I could run the length of my block, which was 0.3 of a mile. And by the time I could do that, which was really only a week, I was hooked on running. And the way I got into long distance running was just as weird. I got these horrible shin splints that I could, run a couple 100 yards, maybe have to stop and go. But miraculously, at either 3 to 4 miles, or 45 minutes, they would go away. So there was no sense in running the shorter distances, so I just continued on and trained for the longer distance, and that's kind of how everything began.
Nice. And so Let's go back to your Navy career. You said after you got out of the Navy, you did the same thing you did in the Navy. Tell me about what you did in the Navy.
Well, originally I was a ER doctor in the Navy, and then I did some operational medicine for a woman. Back then we couldn't go on ships, but I taught combat medicine, and then I ran a few ERs. But I eventually ended up in administration, which was in the disability system, which meant that we determined whether a sailor could continue in the Navy or not, and if not, what his disability benefits were. I did the exact same thing when I became a civilian working for the Army, because the disability system is essentially the same across all the services. So I did that for my last 27 years.
Well, and it seems like the more I get to know about you, the more connections I have. My wife was an ER nurse for 20 years. My son is in the Navy right now. He's in EOD.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. So, I'm like, wow, I'm really glad to have met you.
Me too.
So you get out, you go to work, in the civilian world. And what do you see as the big difference there?
Well, I was actually pretty fortunate because I never have, I guess since before I went even to medical school, I've never had to work in the civilian sector for real. Even when I was a civilian, when I retired, I was still working for the Army, and that's a big, one big family. The camaraderie and the caring about each other in the military is amazing. And you don't have, you do have some of the stabbing in the back, but really everybody sticks together and has your back. It's much different in the civilian world. I think it's more dog eat dog, and I'm very grateful, at least medically, that I didn't have to deal with all that billing shit. Billing stuff and all the administrative and insurance. So I've been blessed my entire career.
So in what age would you say you were when you really started into running? Late 40s, early 50s. Wow. So there's hope still for me.
Yes. That's what I always tell people. You never know what's going to happen.
Well, I tell you, I used to do a lot of running, but it got to where it was tough on the knees. How do you deal with that?
Well, I don't now. I got shingles in 2016, and then I had this post-shingles nerve pain called post-herpetic neuralgia, and that just did me in for a year. So I got I couldn't walk, run, or anything. Things that were rubbing against my back was just excruciating. So I finally got rid of that after 13 months of hell, and then I got sick, and I was in the hospital for 5 weeks. So all in all, I was out of running for almost 2 years, and I really couldn't come back to the running. So now I just do the long distance walking.
Well, and you mentioned earlier that you had gotten into long distance running, and you breezed right over that. But you're not talking about I did a 10-mile run, which sounds like that's outrageous. Talk about the distances that you've covered.
Well, mostly, initially I was into marathons, and this is kind of funny nowadays, but my big accomplishment back in, I think, 95 or 96 was that I did 3 marathons in 14 days. Now that's nothing, but back then it was unheard of. But I also got interested in ultras, which is anything more than 26.2 miles. So my first ultra was a 31-miler in one of the battlefields. I lived in Virginia at that time. And then I did a 50-miler over New Year's, which really got me intrigued. I've always been slow, so these poor people have to hang around and wait for me. But that really caught my eye. And in 2012, I heard of this race, which is called Vol State. Tennessee is the volunteer state, so it's a 500K, 314-mile race across Tennessee. And I started watching it. At that point, all we had was email lists. And then in 14, I thought, I can do this. I have no idea why I thought that. So I signed up, and I tried it in 14. I only made 100 miles. And then I got pulled because I couldn't keep up with the time limits. But ever since then, I've been totally hooked.
Wow. Wow, it just floors me. You say you only made 100 miles.
Well, my real big accomplishment, which wasn't the accomplishment I would like, was that I tried to walk across the United States in 2019, but I only made it 716 miles. I made it through California and Arizona, and I had this injury in my foot that my friend, who was an orthopedic doctor, actually came to Arizona to check it out, and she was worried that it was a stress fracture or even a ruptured tendon, and they didn't want me going into New Mexico, which is pretty barren, in case something had happened. So I had to abort that at 716 miles, and I then, of course, came the pandemic, so I'm not sure I'll ever get back to it.
Wow, and how old were you when you did the 700 miles?
Well, you see, it was 2019 was, 4 years ago? So I was 70.
This is amazing. I first learned about you from Dr. Rob Gilbert, a friend of mine that I've done some work with, and he tells your story and was telling, as you were doing, I think something that was a couple days. What event was that?
You mean the recent one?
Yes.
That was 10 days across Tennessee, and that's that one I told you I got hooked on in 2012, 2014. So I'd done it since the pandemic. I did 21, 22, and 23, and he recently was nice enough to follow me as I did it in 23. So that was 314 miles in 10 days. Wow.
That just floors me. So how do you, I guess, what drives you to do something like that?
That's a very good question. I think it's just to see if I can. I'm short, I'm old, I'm slow, and I just want to see what I can endure. I get bored with everything else. I've always been kind of bored, and I think that's why I went into emergency medicine. There's always some kind of excitement, and I think that kind of fulfills that now. But I'm not really sure. I don't have any great why that most people do.
and so, well, I don't know that anybody has a great why. You just do what you do, right?
Yes, I agree with that.
And you mentioned now that you're more into the long distance walking. What sort of events are there related to that?
Well, pretty much anything you can do. Ultra running. You can do with the ultra walking, and this race across Tennessee is done. Well, a lot of people start out running and then they end up walking because that's a really long distance to cover. Yeah. The front leaders, the probably first, second, and third, maybe 4 and 5, they'll actually run, I would say 90% of the race, but the rest of us just, give up. I start by walking and I stay walking. There's also these other events that, again, are for both runners and walkers, and they're called fixed time events, meaning you have 72 hours, 6 days, 10 days, and you can walk 1 mile, 100 miles, whatever you can do in that period of time is what you get. So it's totally up to you as long as you get it done in that period of time. The one like Tennessee and marathons, things like that, are what's called fixed distance. You have to cover that distance or you don't qualify. Nice. So it's a little bit of difference. The fixed time ones, in my opinion, are a lot easier. They're good training, but they're not. The one in Tennessee, I have to carry all of my gear, food and water that I'm going to need for 10 days if I can't buy it in the convenience store. Whereas in most of these other events, it's everything is provided. They have aid stations. They don't have that at these other events.
Nice. And I was looking you up online, and I ran into something called Getting Unstuck. What is that?
Well, that's interesting you found that. That was my online business that I kind of had on the side. It's metaphysics. I got very into metaphysics when I was here in San Antonio in 1985, and this woman became my mentor and then eventually my business partner. She subsequently passed away, but it's bringing metaphysics and the concept of mind-body medicine in your entire spiritual world. You always hear me say, everything always works out for me. It's the power of thought and how you feel about things. So that's what we would do teleseminars. At that time, they didn't have webinars, so they were all lectures by phone, but it was the same purpose as a, webinar right now. And it was a lot of fun at that time. So I would post articles, but you could tell by the looking at it, I've let that lapse.
Okay. And so what, I guess other than you're walking, you're exercising, what do you do now? What is your passion?
And mostly it's writing. I have been pretty lucky in that I've gotten, I published a book in 2006 called Your Doctor Said What, which I thought was a pretty good book, but I ended up having to sue the publisher just to get the rights to my book. It was a vanity publisher, and I didn't know anything at that time, and I got screwed, bottom line. But then, I guess a year ago, I published a book about the 2021 Tennessee race called It's Not About the Miles. And what I did, that was just phenomenal for me to be able to do that. I took the race and all the life lessons that I learned from it, and then the life lessons from my career, and I just combined them as well as talking about the race. And then I have another one that's in people's hands being edited and get ready to put up on Amazon. And it's about the 2022 race, but it ended up really being more about childhood trauma and how trauma and stress affect your body and how you need to pay attention to your body. It's really interesting how that evolved. So, and then I got another idea when I just did this race, so I'm working on that one too.
Excellent. So how can people find out more about you? Where are you online?
Well, mostly Facebook, and you can just search for Terrie Wurzbacher, but I have a website, terriewurzbacher.com, where I post most of the things I put on Facebook. I copy and paste them and put on my blog. Those are the easiest ways to find me.
Nice.
And of course, on Amazon, they could find my books there. So.
Yeah, I'll definitely put links to all your stuff in the show notes.
Thank you.
Oh, you bet. And being a Texan and having been to San Antonio many times, there's Wurzbacher Road there. Is there any relation?
Well, it's Wurzbach Road without the ER, but this is the only city that I've ever been able to tell people my name and not have to spell it 25 times. Because I just tell them it's like the road with the ER, and if they're from this area, that's not a big deal. I don't think there's any relation. There's a lot of Germans in this area, Fredericksburg, for instance, and Green and all of that, but I don't know of any family that's from here, which means absolutely nothing, as you know.
Sure. Well, that's awesome. Another thing we have in common, I'm German too. So.
All right.
Yeah. Excellent. Dr. Wurzbacher, I want to thank you so much for sharing some of your story with us. You're definitely an inspiration, and we'll definitely be following you.
I appreciate that so much, and thank you for having me on.